Hey, so hello and welcome to another episode of Grief Unedited. This is a space where we have real, awe and raw, try again, real, awe and raw, honest conversations about grief and loss. I'm your host, Karen Lafferty, and I'm an accredited counsellor specialising in grief, and I've worked with people for over a decade, helping them to navigate their journey of loss. If you want to connect with me, I am on Facebook and Instagram, and both of those are at Continuum Counselling. Or you can also find me on my website, which is www.continuumcounselling.com. I always want to start by saying that this podcast is purely for educational purposes, so the views that are expressed in it are my own, and they don't represent any of the third parties that I work on behalf of or alongside. And lastly, I always give a bit of a content warning before we dive into the episode, just to acknowledge that these conversations are real, they are unedited, so please do use your own discretion when listening along. If there's anything in today's episode that feels triggering in any way or just difficult for you, feel free to take a pause and step away. We know that grief can be a really overwhelming experience, so listen to your own wisdom and listen to what helps and what doesn't help at this stage of your journey. So in today's episode, I have got the lovely Sarah Stewart with me today, and we're going to be talking about the experience of losing a parent as a teenager. So before we get too far into that, Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you, my love, if you don't mind, just giving us a bit of your background, introduce yourself, let people know who you are.
Amazing. Thank you, Karen. And excited to be here and chatting with you. So my name's Sarah. I am currently self-employed. I have been for nearly 4 years now. I'm from Aberdeen, but I live now in Glasgow in Scotland. And I lost my mum sadly when I was a teenager. And it's actually, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but where I've landed at now in my self-employment has been very much driven by my story in losing my mum.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a time and project management expert. I help small businesses get more time for the things that really matter. I like to think that my approach is more holistic, mindful, intentional. It's not just about your schedule and task management. There's like a softer side to it as well. But I think it's been driven by the fact that, I lost my mum at such a young age, and I've always had this acute awareness then that our time is limited, our time is precious. And so when I reflect back on my story, time has sort of been there through everything really that I've done. So it's nice to then land in this spot where, I'm using my skills and my knowledge to now help other people.
Amazing. And I think that's the thing, like, there's something really poignant about that idea of time and just how, for lots of people, they have an assumption of, lots of time ahead of themselves. And, I think when you come in contact with grief, it really does compound the sense of like, you just don't know what's around that next corner. So, I'm excited to get into our conversation, and something I suppose that might feel quite different in our conversation that we were talking about just before we hit record was that your mum passed quite a while ago now, and actually there's something really interesting about what grief looks like over time as well. I'm very conscious that most of my guests have been, fairly newly bereaved, maybe within the last 5 years or so. So I'm excited to see what it's been like for you in that journey of time as well, and I suppose where you're at now in your grief journey, like 20 whatever years down the line. So does it feel okay to tell us a wee bit about your mum and just set the scene a little bit of kind of what your grief journey looked like, and then I suppose in those early
Yeah.
days?
So where to start? So I grew up in Aberdeen. I've got a younger sister. She's a year and 9 months younger than I am. And we lived in, a small house, my mum, dad, me and my sister. And in all other respects, I had a great childhood
Mm.
and, really enjoyed my time. For the most part, got on well with my sister. We're very good friends now. I think that is also potentially something that's, maybe shifted because we've not had our mum through our
Mm.
adult life, is that, my sister and I are very close. Um, and everything was fine, and I was doing pharmacy, so my degree's pharmacy, and I chose to stay at home for my studies. And it's interesting because I had applied to all these different universities and potentially could have been away from home,
Mm.
but something, and I'm not quite possibly a boy was involved, but there on some level, I think there was also something that was keeping me at home.
Mm.
And actually, now on reflection, I'm really glad I was there because then it was in between my second and third year of uni that my mum passed. So I was at high school when she first got ill. I was 16 and she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And it's funny how some things I can remember so, so vividly. Like I
Yeah.
remember the exact spot on the sofa where I was sat when my dad like came into the room to tell us that mum had cancer. And she'd been not really unwell, but there were some signs there. And what was hilarious, like we used to laugh at it, like and on reflection, it's maybe not the nicest, but she became very bloated and was
Mm.
very gassy and and so and we would all just be having a right old
Mm.
chuckle, until we then discovered that yeah, that this was not good. And she was actually it was something crazy. Like when she went in for surgery, I think they like took off like drained 10 liters of fluid off of her
Wow.
abdomen or something like that.
Gosh.
It was wild.
Mm.
Um, but I remember my dad coming in to tell us your mum's got cancer. And I remember like I can also vividly picture being in the school common room and telling my friends and like getting a bit upset and things. Like
Mm.
it, yeah, it wasn't great. And my mum was in hospital for a while. She was very quickly taken in for surgery, had a, full hysterectomy and they drained all the fluid and so on. And then she went in to have chemo. Um, but the that whole journey, I think my mum was obviously putting on a brave face for us all. I don't really remember her complaining or anything.
No.
Um, I do remember, and this just like gives you an indication of the timeline,
Mm.
I do remember us having a conversation and we got a new telephone for the house because we only had a wired phone and we
Ah,
needed we needed to get a cordless phone so that my mum could have it next to her in the bedroom so that because she couldn't get up so easily or whatever to get the phone.
mm.
Um, and then after she'd recovered a bit from the chemo and things, I remember her getting a new car because her original car didn't have power steering. So it was
Mm.
like
Mm.
quite an effort for her to drive the car. But like aside from those couple of little things, like I don't remember loads about that initial journey. Um, and whether that's because my brain is like protecting, and it's all there, but it's like being
Mm.
suppressed and stuff. I don't know. Um, but she became well again and went back to work. She was working part-time. And I do remember there being a little bit of a blip in the journey, and I was actually in America doing one of these Camp America type
Oh, yeah.
things
Uh-huh.
and was away for the summer. And I remember getting a phone call to say that there was like a blood result that maybe wasn't quite right and they were going to be doing more tests or whatever. But I was told to stay, continue my trip, which I did. Um, I did take one day off and sort of spent a day feeling a bit upset and moping. Um, but by the time I came home, things seemed okay again. Um, and so my mum, I think she was in like a clinical trial, so she was sort of getting closer. They were following her more closely
Mm. Mm.
post all the chemo. And, whether I think that then like worked in her favor in a sense that when there were changes, she was very quickly seen.
Yeah.
Um, And so it then became, I was then at university, and I had gone away on holiday. So in between second and third year, I'd gone off on a holiday to Israel. One of my close friends from uni was from Israel, and I went to go and stay with her family. And we were
Wow.
doing some touristy things over there and a bit of traveling. Um, and then I got a phone call, which to me came out of the blue from my dad to say, your mum's been told she's got a week left. You need to come home
Mm.
immediately. Um, and I think I think I knew that I think she'd like gone in for a scan, and there were things happening, but not to the extent where I thought she was going, to be terminal.
Yeah.
Um, so that was an awful phone call. And then
Mm.
here's me in Israel on like my own, with my friend's family. And so they helped me. They took me to a travel agent because then we had to obviously sort my flights to get me home.
Get
The
you home.
earliest I could get back was the next day. And I think to get home, they were trying to get me back. I think I had to do like 4 flights on my own to
Oh,
get home.
crikey. Right.
And so I was 19 at this point. Yes, I traveled lots, but I wasn't really a seasoned traveler, and really I was just a kid still.
Mm.
Um, and so I remember being in Frankfurt as an overlay for the next flight, which I think was going to be taking me to Glasgow. Um, and my dad had said he would drive down and pick me up. So he would come down from Aberdeen to get me. And I remember sitting in the airport, and it came up on the screen that my flight was cancelled. And I was
Mm.
just like, oh my God, I was bawling my eyes out. I remember being up at the desk with the information desk for the airline, sort of saying, I have to get home. I don't know what's
Yeah.
happening. Like, my mum's dying. And so they then managed to get me on an alternative flight, and they flew me then into Edinburgh. And then I even got a flight from Edinburgh to Aberdeen, which was like the shortest flight that I have ever been on, which
Oh,
was crazy, but it saved my dad a trip. Um, and I remember then, my dad picked me up at the airport, and we went to the hospital to go see my mum. And at this point, she was still in Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, and she was really pleased to see me back. Um, and it was at that point, so we'd been told she had a week, but in actual fact, I can't remember the exact timing, but she probably lasted another month or so, maybe like
okay.
4 to 6 weeks, maybe
Mm.
thereabouts. Um, I do remember a number of the conversations in that period being, it was hard. And
Mm.
so my mum wanted to come home. She wanted to die at home. Okay.
Mm.
Okay, emotional. And I I didn't feel that I was going to cope with that.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and so like I remember having a conversation with my dad and one of the nurses, and I sort of said, I don't think I can do this.
Mm.
Because my dad was still working,
Of
and
course. Right.
I
Okay.
think a lot of the care would have then landed with me.
Mhm.
Um, and I think my dad also, acknowledged that um, it wouldn't be fair. I think if I remember correctly, I think his mum died when he was young, and I think she died at home, and he had awful memories and trauma because of
Mm. Of that
that.
experience. Yeah.
So I think he was on board with the decision, but we made the decision that she wasn't going to come home, and that I still, that was her wish, and like, so it's
Yeah.
hard. Um, that's like one of the regrets around her passing. Um, but she got put into a lovely hospice. So she sort of quickly moved from the hospital to the hospice, and it was lovely.
Mm.
And they looked after her so well. Um, but it was then like a lot for me. So, you know, I was then, I think at one point my dad injured his shoulder or something, so he couldn't even drive, and I'm having to drive, and um, my mum's mum was still alive, so I was taking my gran to the hospice, taking my sister to the hospice, having to drive my dad to the hospice. As I say, I think he, from what I recall, I think he was still like doing a bit of work. Um, but it was obviously my summer holidays. And my sister, she was transitioning between high school to university. So that was
Okay.
her sort of summer. Um, and I remember another memory from that time was it was my sister's high school prom,
Mm.
and I had to take her in her prom dress up to the hospice so she could go see mum.
Good to hear. Yeah.
That was hard.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but for the most part, it was okay. You could really see that she was going downhill and it was happening quite fast. And as I say, she was so well looked after, and there was all these
Mm.
complementary therapies, and that, you know, I think she reconnected with her faith,
Wow.
um, lots of different things. And I think she was at peace,
Yeah.
but it was really hard for me.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It strikes me that sometimes when we're in those kind of very end of life conversations, you know, it's like family members do everything that they can to make sure that their loved one is comfortable and has whatever they need, you know, to try and be at peace and physically as comfortable as they can. But, you know, sometimes that can put a huge pressure on, you know, people like yourself that I really heard what you
Yeah.
said there about being the one that's kind of ferrying everyone else around, and, you know, normal life was still going on to some extent, and you're trying to kind of keep some semblance of normality as well as making sure that,
Yeah.
you know, everybody got to their visits and were where they needed to be. And yeah,
Yeah. So it was a lot. And
gosh, yeah.
um I think, you know, in some ways it was sort of life as normal. And
Mm.
like I mean, I remember I was like, I think I started dating a guy like at the same sort of time. Like, what was I thinking?
Hindsight is
Um,
a wonderful thing, isn't it?
you know, and I think, you know, one of the things, like, we didn't talk about it. We were not a family of talking about what was happening. And I remember like most conversations at the hospice when we went to visit, when my mum was still sort of lucid and with it, you know, we would get her out. I remember we would take her to the cafe at the hospice, and she would get like a can of Coke, and drink it with a straw. And then she would be like burping, and we'd be
Yeah.
all laughing, thinking this was hilarious. Um, but most of the conversations were like around the staff at the hospice, and
Mm.
I would be asking questions around, oh, what do the people in the blue outfits do, and what's, you know, and it was all very much about the then and the now and what was going
Yeah.
on, rather than talking about the bigger stuff.
Mm.
And so we shied away from all of that. Um, and so I think, I don't know, I think it got to the point then where like I knew it was coming. And there was one visit where the tables really turned.
Mm.
Like she was still in bed. She couldn't really get up. She was hallucinating quite a bit, which was
Mm.
hard.
Medication she was on, I would imagine.
Um, and you know, she wasn't at this point, she then wasn't really able to eat or anything. So it was me feeding her little ice chips
Yeah.
so that she could get like some water in her mouth. And I think because, I mean, she was 51, so she was still
So
really
young.
young.
Yeah.
And the doctors were sort of like, it's really just a case of waiting for her other organs and systems to slowly pack in, because everything else was sort of healthy.
Mm.
Um, So it was hard, but then very quickly she sort of went downhill. And another vivid memory is so we didn't have mobile phones at that
Mhm.
point. Well, my dad didn't. I had just got like my first mobile phone, and it was this like brick. It was I mean, it wasn't even a Nokia, it was a Bosch. It was a
A
Bosch,
Bosch.
and it was a
Wow.
brick, this massive phone. And because we wanted my dad to be contactable, he took my phone. And I remember being woken up in the middle of the night and it was a house phone that was ringing.
Mm.
And my dad didn't pick it up. No, like no one picked it up. And straight away I heard my phone ringing downstairs, my mobile phone, and
You just knew.
I knew that
Mm.
that was what that phone call was.
Mm.
And I think that was hard because you see on TV all these stories of the family rallying around, and she was on her own.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's hard.
I think some people as well, I don't want to take away from your experience with your mum, but I'm also getting my real awareness that for some people, when they go into that process of dying, there is something about wanting the autonomy of not having lots of people round about them. And I've had
Yeah,
countless stories over the years of families who have kept vigil by somebody's bedside, for days and weeks at a time. And it's that one moment that somebody's stepped out to the toilet and the person's on their own that, you know, they just seem to have, and I would again, I don't know how it happens. I don't know the level of control we have over it, but I do have a real belief that there's something in that. That's not just by chance that those moments happen. So
yeah,
yeah,
I've heard that as well. So
yeah.
yeah,
I suppose the difficulty though is in the absence of the conversations. It's like we don't know what your mum would have wanted in that moment.
yeah,
I suppose that's the hard part, is you're left not knowing, was that the right thing for her, or would she have wanted to, have everybody, with her
yeah.
and round her bedside.
And I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but whether those conversations were happening with my mum and dad, quite possibly.
Maybe, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, but certainly my sister and I were not party to that. And I think there probably was a sense of them trying to protect us. And they were doing their best.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it almost feels like you were in that really difficult space age-wise of like an adult to all intents and
Yeah.
purposes, I suppose. And you were the one that was driving everybody else around and making sure they were, getting where they needed to be, and yet maybe not regarded as an adult in that way, and not,
Yeah.
brought into the fold of the important conversations.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So yeah, so that was then like the phone call. And I remember that vividly.
Mm.
And then it's sort of my memory gets a bit muddy, I guess. And I think, yeah, I can remember having conversations with my dad around, like we had to pick music for the funeral, and we were like picking out mum's favorite songs. Um, and I can sort of remember being in the living room before we went into the funeral cars. I do not remember the funeral
No.
itself. And it was actually, so my mum's mum passed away last year or the year before, and she was 99 when she passed away. And I remember having a conversation at her funeral, and we were talking about someone else's funeral. And I thought I was talking about my mum's funeral, and I was like, oh, remember when Gran did this or whatever. And it actually wasn't my mum's funeral that I was remembering. It was my grandfather's funeral.
Okay.
Um, and and so like whereas my sister can picture my mum's funeral, she can picture where we were sat, all of those kind of
Mm.
things, whereas I have blocked all of that out. Um, yeah, so it is interesting how, yeah, whether it's like a protective thing. Um, yeah,
Some people experience it almost as a, without sounding like super clinical, but almost like a dissociative state where it's like they know where they are and they know they're there, but they almost feel kind of out of body experiences when they're in situations like. And again, it could be a protective thing that it's the mind's way of just buffering the intensity of the experience as well. But it's interesting how you have like no memory and your sister's memory is like super vivid.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Um, and then, as I say, because I chose to stay in Aberdeen, I was there and I was at home,
Yeah,
and it meant that I could be there for the family. But it then meant that I was at university, I had a part-time job, and then I had a house to maintain. So then
yeah.
all of a sudden I was doing the weekly food shop.
Mm.
I was cleaning, I was doing the laundry, and my dad was working, and like my sister was younger, and so it sort of fell on me.
Mm.
Um, and and then of course not forgetting there's the grief as well, so there was a lot going on for me at that point in time. Um, and I was struggling with it. Um, I was the first of my friends who'd lost a parent. So
Okay,
no one really knew,
got it. Yep.
how to deal with that. I did see a bereavement counsellor,
Mm.
that I think my GP had arranged for me. I don't remember my sister going to see someone, but I definitely, like, I've always sort of been open to help, and
Mm.
if anyone's offering something, I'm always open to try.
Amazing.
And I found it really helpful. So I had a counselor for a while, and um, the other thing that we did, my dad got me a life coach. And so with the counselor, we sort of talked maybe more about, some of my regrets. We talked about stories about mum and various different things. Whereas with the life coach, it was a lot more practical
Mm.
stuff that we
Okay.
did
Yeah.
in terms of, okay, you've got all of these things you need to do. How are we going to fit this into your schedule so that you can still have a life and see your
Mm.
friends, um and we talked about how to prioritize and all of those different things, which ultimately have then sort of led me to where I am now in a professional
Yep.
capacity. And even when I think about, so I finished my degree. Actually, there's a good story in that as well. But I finished my degree, got a first class
Wow.
honors, um, went on to
Gosh.
went on to do a PhD. So like I really feel there was a point where I could have gone one of two ways,
Mm.
and I started to drink more and I was partying more, and really burning the candle at both ends. And my mum had always sort of had this mantra of work hard, play hard. And I think I
Mm.
really took it to heart and I was going for it.
Mm.
Um, and I think I probably could have gone down the way when I managed to dig deep and actually ended up excelling.
Right.
Um, but when I got my PhD, I ended up working in the pharmaceutical industry and I niched into project management. So again, leveraging all those skills of
Yep.
time, and all the scheduling and the different work that I'd done with that coach took me through like my whole professional career and then now to where I am in self-employment.
That's quite incredible, and it struck me as well that 20 odd years ago, life coaches weren't that. That wasn't really a thing that people did. So that was I suppose, a really forward-thinking approach of, yeah, let's get some emotional support, but also that real practical bit of like, right, how do we continue to do life when
Yeah,
you had so much on your plate?
yeah.
Mm.
And the one when I was doing my degree, and I think I've told this story before, on another podcast maybe, but
Mm.
I was in my fourth year, and one of the modules we had to do was palliative care. So it
Okay,
was
okay.
very close to home for me. I found it really hard. But because I had that lived experience, I found it quite easy to tap into and talk about and write about and so on. And one of the exam questions, and I'm amazed that they managed to get this into the exam paper because obviously the university knew what I had gone through.
Mm,
They'd been involved. They had set me up with a counsellor, but we just didn't quite connect. And so
mm.
I didn't sort of continue to pursue that. But the exam question was all about Mrs. Stewart, who had cancer, who had two daughters,
Oh, bloody
and
hell.
could you come up with a holistic plan for her care?
Oh, you literally couldn't make that up, could you?
No, I know, down to the name, like the
Mm,
same name. I could not believe it. But I managed to hold it together. I managed to write a fantastic response because it was my
you lived it.
story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I won the prize. I won the Pfizer prize because I got the top mark.
Good on you. Yeah. Gosh, I can't even imagine what that must have felt like in that moment where you just read that question. I can imagine having to like almost double take it and be like, what?
Yeah,
Like,
I know. I
jeez.
put in a complaint after because I was
Good
like,
on
this
you.
was really
Yeah.
not fair.
Yeah.
Um, but I did. I managed to do it. I managed to hold it together.
Mm,
Um, and one of the other sort of interesting things, like off the back of my mum passing, so I've got Crohn's disease,
okay.
and but I was diagnosed like in the year after she passed. So again, it's this whole like the body holds on to the
Yeah.
trauma and whether it's that or whether it's something else, I guess there's these things are complex, but I do wonder like the timeline is quite
Yeah.
telling.
Yeah. And I think that's sometimes the thing that surprises people often is like the real visceral aspects of grief that, you feel it in your body and you only need to speak to a bereaved person that, gets that aspect of it. But I think all too often, we think of grief as like, yeah, we just feel sad for a bit and then eventually it goes away and we're all right again, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, so multifaceted.
Yeah.
Mm,
And I mean, I can remember as well, like my mum, so where we lived, we were on a main road, and my mum would work part time, and on the days when she was working, I would normally get home from school before her. So sometimes I would like be at the house and I would see her getting off the bus, and there was times after she passed, I was convinced I saw her, and
yeah,
there was just it was so raw and real and hard and um yeah, it was difficult, really difficult at the start.
mm,
um and then I then got to I would have then been 21 and I moved away. I then chose to move away for my studies. So after you've done a pharmacy degree, you do a pre-registration year.
mm,
And I chose to move to Edinburgh to go and do my pre-registration year so that I could spend half of my time in industry. There weren't any opportunities in Aberdeen. So I sort of moved away. And I think probably being away from the house helped because
yeah.
everything was still the same at the house. Um, and I sort of then, I guess, started out on my own path.
I'm keen to hear I suppose what feels like your relationship to grief now, because I know obviously before we started recording as well, we were talking about, I suppose, how grief changes over time. So yeah, can you tell us a bit about what's it feel like for you now, day to day? What's your relationship to it?
So a lot of the time, I don't notice it. I don't,
Mm,
it's not there. Um, I think about my mum a lot, an awful lot.
mm,
I think, I think because of what I do now and because it's very much part of my story, I am sharing and talking about it a lot. Um, there's lots of things that happen that I wish she was there for.
Yeah.
Um, I've had, yeah, a complicated story since she passed. Like I'm currently a single mum. I did get married. I've had two kids, divorced now, and all of these sort of big landmark things, you sort of,
Mm.
I wish she had been there. I remember when I was getting married, like lots of drama around who was going to be at the top table, um, and just, yeah, lots of things where I wish she had been there.
Mm.
I remember being flagged, like when the kids were, when my first son was born, um, and sort of been flagged as a at-risk parent, like mum for
Wow.
postnatal depression or whatever, because my son was premature and I didn't have my mum. And so these were
Mm.
like sort of like two red flags. And it was hard. Like
Mm.
we had I had a hard journey into motherhood. So my son was 7 weeks premature.
Bless
Um,
him. Mm.
and he ended up in hospital, and so when he was maybe like 5 weeks old, so before he was even due to be born, he was then in York Hill having an operation on his tummy. Um, and all these little things, like whenever I get ill, I'm like, oh, I wish there was someone to care and nurture for
Yeah.
me, Um, so yeah, it's always there, but
Yeah.
then in some respects it's not. Like, so I think day to day, I'm normally okay. We were talking just before we hit record about,
Mm.
I'm so fascinated by this ability to time travel. So sometimes there'll be a song that comes on the radio, or there'll be like a whiff of a smell that takes you back to a particular moment in time. And that can be really hard because it sort of catches you out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's other times where I do want to take myself there on my own.
Mm.
I have a playlist in my Spotify full of songs that my mum loved
Oh,
that,
beautiful.
that I just play and cry.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that idea actually of just something. There's that connection to your mum in those songs, I guess, as well. And something that you can just tap into when you want to remember, when you want to be
Yeah.
close to your grief. Yeah. We talked obviously as well about the idea of like that analogy that it gets better over time, and I think people do still genuinely believe that. And I suppose to some extent it does get better over time, but it doesn't mean that your grief is any less, and I think
Yeah.
that's it's really apparent that, smell of something that reminds you of your mum, or just hearing something or a conversation can really take you back into those real raw emotions, and just that absence of her in your life, and those big,
Yeah.
those big life moments where you just want your mum.
I'm sure I've heard someone before talk about, it's the grief stays the same, but it's the
Yeah.
box around it that gets bigger and your ability to cope and manage. And so I would agree with that analogy, definitely. Um, and yeah, some friends have lost their parents, and but more recently, like in the last sort of 5 years, and the people that are closer to it, those that were maybe at the 5 year mark were sort of saying, it does get easier with time. Whereas I then am like quietly sobbing in the corner thinking
Yeah.
the opposite.
Mm-hmm. The model that you've described her here is the work of Lois Tonkin, and she calls it like growing around grief, because the idea was that, with time, if you ask most people what happens to grief, most people's assumption was that it lessens over time, but she recognised that it doesn't lessen over time, but we become better resourced, more confident in managing our grief. We start to figure out what helps us and what doesn't over time. But her original theory was quite linear to an extent, and that the space around our grief got bigger kind of year on year, if you like, but it's been revised into something a bit different, because what we've come to realise and recognise is that there will be periods in our grief journey that our grief just becomes more acute. So sometimes it's coming up to big anniversaries, maybe like 10 years, 20 years.
Yes.
Other
Yeah.
times it's, things that just pop up in our world that really take us to a place of feeling like we've not managed our grief as well as we thought. And it's not that at all. It's just that our grief becomes more raw, it comes back to the surface for us. So I
Yeah.
kind of like the flexibility of that, of like some months, some years you feel like, yeah, I'm doing okay with this, but then there might also be times that you do go back into that space of thinking, no, actually I do need a bit of support, or it's time to
Yeah.
think about some therapy, or to speak to my friends about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. One of the years that I struggled with was, so I was 19 when she passed, and then when I got to the point where I had lived longer without her than I had lived
Yeah,
with her,
with
that was
her.
hard.
Yeah, yeah. And those are the things that, again, if you pick up a book about grief, it generally doesn't prepare you for those types of moments where, there's that real, yeah, just that real realization of actually, gosh, you've had more of your life without your mum than you've had with her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she passed on the longest day as
Oh,
well. So I always sort of feel, gosh, of all the days, it was the longest day. Um, so yeah, that can be hard. Um, what's interesting, I mean, so my dad has remarried, and I mean he did remarry fairly quickly, I would say, but each to their own. And but like I remember one year, we were going out for, like, he'd booked a dinner, or he was coming to Edinburgh to see me or something, but it was the anniversary of my mum passing, and I don't think he had quite clocked it.
oh, the day. Okay.
And so for me, it was like such a big deal. And I was, but, you know, sh I think my mom does not really get talked about anymore.
Mm, mhm.
So that's hard. So, I will sort of talk about her very, occasionally with my sister. Um, but we don't really talk about her with our dad. So that's hard. And that was hard, sort of having to put a face on and, go out for dinner when
Mm,
really it probably wasn't what I wanted to be doing,
mm,
on
yeah.
that day.
Have you found anything over the years then, or yeah, is there anything that's kind of become apparent that's really helped you manage your grief? Have you got any kind of go-tos that, yeah, are tried and tested for you, Sarah?
So I do think when I'm in a mood where I'm maybe feeling more emotional, I just allow myself to lean into it. So
Mm,
and I will put on the playlist, bawl my eyes out, and just let it move through me.
yeah.
Um, some of the other things that I do, I guess, it's more just around all the different grounding things that I would be doing. So, like, getting myself out in nature, like, I find
Mm,
walking really helps. I really like being by the sea. Um, and I really like to journal as well.
okay.
So I think journaling helps me. Um, and I would just, write out, without really editing it, just write out what's there. And I did actually start to sort of capture a bit of the journey, like, because I found at one point some files that I had typed up on the computer about my story, like, when my mum got
Wow, right,
ill, and
okay.
the diagnosis and different things. And so I think just that process of writing, like, I really like to write,
Hmm.
and I found that really helpful. And then just the talking.
Yeah.
So, I've dipped in and out of counseling and coaching, and I've had a therapist as well. Um, and it's something, that I always sort of come back to. I find that it's really beneficial.
I think that's how we make sense of things that don't make sense as well, whether it's talking out loud, whether it's writing it down. I find often clients find journaling really beneficial for just getting their thoughts out of their heads. And to me, it's all roads lead back to the same thing of like it's how our brain makes sense of things that, just don't make sense to us. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's
And
real power in that.
and the other thing that I've been doing, So, I when my mum was in the hospice, she got fantastic care. As I said, I sort of feel like there was a bit of a gap in terms of support for my sister and I.
Mm,
Um, and so I'd always had it in my head that I would love to give back in some way. And now I do. So when I went self-employed and I had full control of my schedule, I was then like, right, okay, now I've got the capacity to do some volunteering work. So I
amazing.
volunteer now with the Prince and Princess of Wales Hospice in Bellahouston Park in Glasgow. And I've been doing that for three, over 3 years now. And I do mindfulness meditations for the outpatient visitors that come. And despite it being like it's an uplifting space, despite the patients coming in having life-limiting conditions, I think,
Mm,
they all have a very positive outlook, and it's a nice space, but it's still loss. And we lose patients that I've got to know really well, and
yeah, that must be hard.
that's hard, and it sort of it can bring it back to, so sometimes I found it quite triggering,
Mm, mhm,
but then in other ways it's also really healing,
mm,
and I really enjoy being able to do something that maybe I couldn't do for my mum.
mm, yeah. And in a way that also is so meaningful for the families that, you're there alongside. And I do genuinely think that there's real power in, that lived experience that you have, that, even if you're not talking about it to people, you just have a knowing of kind of what they're going through and what it's like for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of the ways that I've, been managing my grief. And then I guess also with my business now, my mission is to get people to think differently about their time
Mm,
and to see their time differently and to be more intentional with their time. We get this one life in our, here in our, whatever your beliefs may be, but in our bodies at this time, we
yeah.
get one life. And it's to try and get people to actually recognize that before they have a health scare or,
Yeah.
whatever that might be, or they face their own loss within their family or whatever. Um, so that is also sort of again another way to make impact and give back. And it's all because of my story and what happened with me and my mum.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing a bit of your mum's journey and obviously your experience with us as well today, Sarah, because I think for me there's something so powerful in not only hearing the journey other people have been on, but also the things that have worked for you, the things that haven't worked for you. I think that hopefully gives people who have listened some things to check out, some things to try for themselves. And I think there's real power in just hearing people's journey of loss and recognising that for all we're different, there's often a lot of similarities in that grief journey as well. So thank you for your honesty in it as well, because yeah, it's a hard journey to walk.
It is.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
How would people connect with you? So if anybody wanted to, get in contact after today's episode, where do they find you?
So I am in lots of different places, as you might expect for a small business owner.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
the main place that you can connect with me is, and the place that I actually like the most is my email newsletter. So I
mm,
write a weekly email that goes out, and normally in my email, it's sort of a little bit more behind the scenes, peel the curtain back a little bit more. Um, and people can jump onto my mailing list through my website, which is sarahstewart.co.uk. And then I'm also on Instagram. That's the other sort of platform that I'm most active on.
amazing.
And my handle there is sarahstewart.co.uk. So hopefully easy enough to find.
Wonderful. I know we talked at the start as well before we hit record about the events that you host at Prince and Princess of Wales Hospice. So again, where do people find out about them if they maybe want to get involved?
Yes, so the best place is to get into my mailing list because I
Okay.
sort of share everything there. And yeah, last year I was running my events are called Connect for a Cause because
Oh,
we give
beautiful.
we give money back to the hospice through the events. Um, I also did the zip line across the Clyde for the
Oh,
hospice last year. That was an
brave.
experience. It was a lot higher than what I had anticipated.
Ah,
But it was good fun and it was nice to do it for a good cause. So yeah, the newsletter is definitely the place to be for sort of all events and different things that I run.
amazing. And as always, we'll link to those different addresses in the show notes because I think it's always useful for people to know, yeah, how to get in touch if they do maybe want to reach out.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the other thing I want to just finish up by saying is obviously not just a huge thank you to you, Sarah, for being along here today and letting us in behind the scenes of your grief journey as well, but also just to acknowledge that if people have been listening along and they found this episode maybe helpful, if there's something that might have resonated in your story that they want to share it with somebody, then please do make sure that you subscribe to the show so that not only do you get updates about new episodes, but you can also find your way back to share this episode if you do think it would be useful for somebody that you care about, or yeah, just something you want to revisit yourself. Um, Lastly, the I suppose the last thing I want to just recap with is just if you do want to get in contact around today's episode at all, obviously we'll link to Sarah's website. Couldn't think of the word there. My brain's gone to sleep. At the end of the show notes, but also to connect with me, I'm at Continuum Counselling, and that's on Facebook and Instagram, and also my website is continuumcounselling.com. So yeah, all it remains for me to say is just a huge thank you, Sarah, for being with us today, and yeah, until our next episode.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen, so much for having me on. Yeah.
Ever so
It's been
welcome. It's been
lovely.
my pleasure.